Have you ever looked in the mirror and wondered if the person staring back at you was really you, or just someone shaped by the voices of others telling you who you should be? Have you ever felt so small, so diminished, that you began to believe the cruel words whispered about you were somehow the truth? Tonight, I want to share with you the story of Sarah Michelle, a 42-year-old woman from Portland, Oregon, whose journey from silence to strength will remind you that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply believing in yourself again. Sarah's story begins not with a dramatic moment, but with the slow erosion that happens when someone you trust begins to chip away at your sense of self, one cutting comment at a time. For nearly 15 years, she had been married to Marcus, a man who possessed the dangerous gift of making his cruelty sound like concern, his control feel like protection. It started so subtly that Sarah barely noticed the way he would casually mention that her laugh was too loud at dinner parties, how he'd suggest that maybe she shouldn't share so many opinions during their friends' conversations, that perhaps she was making people uncomfortable with her intensity. These weren't screamed accusations or obvious put-downs. They were delivered with a gentle smile, wrapped in the language of someone who claimed to want the best for her. "I'm just trying to help you understand how you come across," he would say, his hand resting on her shoulder with what looked like affection but felt like a weight. Over the years, these small corrections accumulated like sediment in her soul. Sarah, who had once been known for her quick wit and infectious energy, began to second-guess every word before it left her lips. She started watching herself through Marcus's eyes, measuring her worth by his reactions. When she got a promotion at the marketing firm where she worked, she came home excited to share the news, only to have him point out that the extra responsibilities would probably stress her out, that she had a tendency to take on more than she could handle. When she suggested they take a weekend trip to visit her sister in Seattle, he reminded her how awkward she got around her family, how she always seemed to regress into old patterns that didn't serve her. Each observation was presented as insight, each criticism wrapped in the promise of helping her become a better version of herself. But the real damage wasn't just happening within the walls of their home. Marcus was careful, strategic in the way he shared his perspective about Sarah with others. At neighborhood barbecues, he would tell funny stories about her quirks, how she once got so passionate about a book club discussion that she accidentally knocked over someone's wine glass, how she had this habit of researching topics so thoroughly that she could overwhelm people with information. To the listeners, these anecdotes seemed harmless, even endearing. But Sarah knew the subtext. She understood that Marcus was carefully crafting a narrative about who she was, someone well-meaning but socially awkward, intelligent but lacking in emotional intelligence, passionate but ultimately exhausting to be around. The most insidious part of emotional manipulation is how it makes you complicit in your own diminishment. Sarah began to tell these stories about herself before Marcus could. She would introduce herself at new gatherings by immediately highlighting her flaws, making self-deprecating jokes about her tendency to talk too much or get too excited about things. She thought this showed self-awareness, but really, she was just echoing the voice that had been planted in her head, speaking Marcus's words in her own voice until she couldn't tell the difference between his opinion and her truth. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March, during what should have been one of the happiest moments of Sarah's career. She had been selected to present her team's innovative marketing campaign to the company's board of directors, a recognition that could have led to a senior executive position. She spent weeks preparing, rehearsing her presentation until she could deliver it flawlessly. The night before the big meeting, she was practicing in their living room when Marcus walked in from work. She turned to him with bright eyes, ready to run through her opening remarks one more time, seeking not his approval but his support. Instead, Marcus looked at her with the expression of barely concealed embarrassment. "Sarah," he said with a sigh, "you're doing that thing again, where you get so caught up in your own excitement that you can't see how it affects other people. You're practically bouncing around the room. Do you really think the board wants to see that level of enthusiasm? It's a little much, don't you think?" He sat down heavily in his chair, rubbing his forehead as if her energy was giving him a headache. "I just worry that you're going to come across as unprofessional. Maybe you should tone it down a bit. Try to be more contained." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. In an instant, all her preparation, all her confidence seemed to crumble. She looked down at her notes, and suddenly, the words that had felt so powerful and clear seemed juvenile, overwrought. The passion she had felt for her work moments before now felt embarrassing, childish. She spent the rest of the evening in her study, rewriting her presentation to be more professional, more contained. She stripped away the personal anecdotes that had made her argument compelling, removed the innovative proposals that had felt too risky, and transformed what had been a bold vision into a safe, forgettable summary of conventional wisdom. The presentation the next day was technically competent, but utterly lifeless. Sarah delivered it with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list, and the board's response was politely disinterested. The promotion went to her colleague David, whose presentation had been full of exactly the kind of passion and innovation that Sarah had edited out of her own. That evening, when she told Marcus what had happened, he consoled her by saying, "Well, at least you didn't embarrass yourself. These things have a way of working out for the best." It was in that moment, sitting in their perfectly appointed living room, with its muted colors and carefully arranged furniture that reflected Marcus's taste rather than her own, that Sarah felt something shift inside her, not the dramatic awakening that movies portray, but something quieter and more profound, a whisper of recognition that said, "This isn't who I am." For the first time in years, she found herself questioning not her own behavior, but Marcus's interpretation of it. She thought about the woman she had been before she met him, someone who had backpacked through Southeast Asia alone at 25, who had started her own freelance marketing business that was successful enough to catch the attention of her current employer, who had been known among her friends as the person you called when you needed someone to believe in you. That night after Marcus had gone to bed, Sarah did something she hadn't done in years. She called her sister Jennifer in Seattle. It had been months since they had spoken, partly because of the distance and their busy lives, but mostly because Sarah had begun to avoid her family. Marcus had convinced her that her relationships with them were complicated and that she tended to get too emotional around them. But sitting in the darkness of her kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear, listening to Jennifer's familiar laugh as she answered, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten, the comfort of being known by someone who remembered who she used to be. "Jen," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you remember when we were kids, and I used to put on those elaborate plays in the backyard? I would write these stories and convince all the neighborhood kids to be in them, and I would direct and star and do all the costumes." Jennifer laughed softly. "Are you kidding? You were like this tiny dictator with pigtails. You had such big ideas. And somehow you always convinced everyone else they were possible too. Mom used to say you could sell ice to penguins." "Why?" Sarah felt tears she hadn't expected forming in her eyes. I was wondering if you thought I was too much back then. Too loud, too intense." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a long moment before Jennifer spoke, her voice serious now. "Sarah, you were never too much. You were exactly enough. You were the person who made everything more interesting, more fun, more possible. What's going on? You don't sound like yourself." It was the phrase, "you don't sound like yourself," that broke something open in Sarah. She began to cry. Not the careful, quiet tears she had learned to shed, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from a place she had locked away years ago. Through her tears, she told Jennifer about the presentation, about Marcus's comments, about the gradual way she had started to see herself through his eyes. Jennifer listened without interrupting, and when Sarah finally stopped talking, her sister's voice was fierce with protective anger. "Sarah, do you hear yourself right now? You're talking about your own personality like it's a problem that needs to be solved. The woman I'm talking to right now, the woman who cared so much about her work that she spent weeks perfecting a presentation, that woman is not too much. That woman is not embarrassing. That woman is passionate and dedicated and brilliant. And if someone is making you believe otherwise, then they're the problem, not you." The conversation with Jennifer planted a seed of doubt. Not doubt about herself, but doubt about the narrative that had been built around her. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to pay attention in a way she hadn't in years. She noticed how Marcus responded to her stories about work, how he would subtly redirect conversations away from her successes and toward her mistakes. She observed how he interacted with other women, how he complimented her friend Lisa's calm energy and her colleague Maria's understated confidence, always in Sarah's presence, always with a meaningful look that suggested these were qualities Sarah herself lacked. But the most revealing moment came during a dinner party they hosted for Marcus's colleagues. Sarah had spent days preparing, wanting everything to be perfect. She had chosen recipes that showcased her love of cooking, a passion that Marcus often dismissed as showing off, and she had planned conversation topics that would engage their guests. During the evening, one of Marcus's coworkers, a woman named Rebecca, complimented the meal enthusiastically. "Sarah, this is incredible. You should seriously consider catering. You have such a gift for bringing flavors together." Before Sarah could respond, Marcus jumped in with a laugh. "Oh, you should see her in the kitchen when she's really going. It's like a tornado hit. She uses every pot and pan we own for one meal." The table laughed, and Rebecca smiled politely. But Sarah caught something in her expression, a flicker of confusion, as if she couldn't reconcile the beautiful meal in front of her with Marcus's description of its chaotic creation. Later that evening, as Sarah was cleaning up, Rebecca returned to the kitchen to offer help. "I hope I didn't overstep with my comment about catering," she said carefully. "I just meant that you clearly have a real talent. I run a small event planning company, and I work with caterers all the time. What you served tonight was restaurant quality." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, the unfamiliar sensation of being seen for her abilities rather than her flaws. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." Rebecca studied her for a moment. "Can I ask you something? Earlier, when your husband mentioned head, a mess in the kitchen, you looked, I don't know, like you were shrinking. But the kitchen is spotless. It doesn't look like a tornado hit at all. It looks like someone who knows what they're doing worked very efficiently to create something beautiful." Sarah stared at Rebecca, feeling as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes. She had been so conditioned to accept Marcus's version of events that she hadn't even questioned his description of her cooking process. The truth was, she was an organized, efficient cook who cleaned as she went and left the kitchen cleaner than she found it. But somehow, in Marcus's retelling, her competence became chaos. Her passion became mess. I guess I've gotten used to seeing myself through other people's eyes," Sarah said slowly. Rebecca nodded knowingly. "I used to do that too. It's amazing how we can lose track of our own truth when someone else's opinion gets louder than our own voice." That conversation marked the beginning of what Sarah would later call her awakening, not the sudden, dramatic kind, but the slow, deliberate process of remembering who she had been before someone else's limitations became her own. She started small, with tiny acts of rebellion that no one else would notice. When Marcus suggested she was being too talkative at a friend's birthday party, she consciously chose to ignore him and continued her conversation about a book she was passionate about. When he implied that her excitement about a new project at work was exhausting, she called Jennifer instead and shared her enthusiasm with someone who reflected it back to her. The more Sarah practiced trusting her own perceptions, the more clearly she could see the pattern of Marcus's behavior. It wasn't that he was deliberately trying to destroy her. She had come to believe that he genuinely thought he was helping her, that in his mind, he was protecting her from embarrassment and social rejection. But his way of loving her required her to become smaller, quieter, less vibrant. His comfort depended on her containment. And for the first time, Sarah began to wonder if that was really love at all, or if it was something else disguised as care. The moment of true clarity came during what should have been a celebration. Sarah's marketing team had won a major industry award for the campaign she had wanted to present to the board, the original version, full of innovation and passion that her colleague David had eventually pitched using many of her ideas. When the award was announced, Sarah felt a complex mix of pride and regret. She had contributed significantly to the winning campaign, but she had also allowed herself to be talked out of presenting her best work when it mattered most. That evening, Sarah came home excited to share the news about the award, thinking that surely Marcus would be happy for her success. Instead, his first response was to point out that she hadn't actually won the award herself, her team had. "I just don't want you to take credit for something that was a group effort," he said, with what looked like concern. "You have a tendency to make everything about yourself." The criticism stung, but for the first time, Sarah didn't automatically accept it. Instead, she thought about Rebecca's words about truth, and she asked herself a simple question. Is this accurate? She thought about the team meeting where her colleagues had specifically thanked her for her creative vision. She remembered David telling her that her original presentation had inspired the approach that won the award. She considered the fact that she had never claimed individual credit for the win, had always spoken about it as a team success. And she realized that Marcus's criticism wasn't based on anything she had actually said or done, it was based on his assumption about who she was, an assumption that seemed designed to diminish her joy rather than protect her from pride. For the first time in 15 years, Sarah looked directly at her husband and said, "That's not true." The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. Marcus blinked, clearly surprised by her direct contradiction. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when he thought she was being unreasonable. "I mean," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that what you just said about me isn't true. I didn't take credit for the award. I shared exciting news about my team's success. And your response was to criticize me for something I didn't do, based on a personality flaw you've assigned to me that doesn't actually match my behavior." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had had in their marriage. Marcus was genuinely confused by Sarah's pushback, and his confusion revealed how thoroughly he had internalized his own narrative about who she was. When she asked him to give her a specific example of when she had taken credit for team successes, he couldn't. When she asked him to explain why her excitement about work was problematic, when he regularly shared his own professional victories with enthusiasm, he struggled to articulate a reason that didn't sound like a double standard. For the first time, Sarah saw her husband not as an authority on her character, but as someone whose opinions about her were no more objective or accurate than anyone else's, and perhaps less so, given how invested he seemed to be in maintaining her small. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. As she began to trust her own perceptions and speak up for herself, Marcus became increasingly frustrated. He accused her of being combative and defensive, of losing the sweet, accommodating nature that he had fallen in love with. These accusations might have devastated the old Sarah, but the woman she was becoming understood them differently. She wasn't being combative, she was having boundaries. She wasn't being defensive, she was defending herself. And the sweet, accommodating nature he missed wasn't her true personality. It was the result of years of training to prioritize his comfort over her authenticity. Sarah began to seek out perspectives beyond Marcus's increasingly negative assessments. She reconnected with old friends who remembered her differently, who reflected back to her the qualities that Marcus had taught her to see as flaws. When her college roommate Emma came to visit, she spent the weekend marveling at Sarah's beautiful home, her successful career, her thoughtful insights about everything from politics to literature. "You're exactly the same as you were in college," Emma told her over coffee. "Still the smartest person in the room, still incredibly generous, still that person who sees possibilities where other people see problems. I don't know how you do it all." Hearing Emma's words, Sarah realized how drastically her self-perception had been altered. The woman Emma described bore no resemblance to the socially awkward, overly intense, fundamentally flawed person that Marcus had convinced her she was. Sarah began to wonder if Marcus's constant corrections and criticisms said more about his own insecurities than about her actual shortcomings. She started to notice how he responded to other confident women, how he found ways to diminish or dismiss their accomplishments, how he seemed most comfortable when the women around him were apologetic about their own strengths. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place during a conversation with her therapist, Dr. Martinez, whom Sarah had started seeing individually after Marcus resisted the idea of couples counseling. Martinez had been helping Sarah understand the dynamics of emotional manipulation, and during one session, she asked Sarah a question that changed everything. If a stranger treated you the way Marcus treats you, constantly correcting your behavior, undermining your confidence, making you feel like you need to apologize for your personality, what would you call that? Sarah sat quietly for a long moment before answering. "I would call it bullying." Dr. Martinez nodded. "And if someone you cared about was being treated this way, what would you tell them?" The answer came immediately. "I would tell them they deserve better." It was a pivotal moment of recognition. Sarah realized she had been extending more compassion and protection to hypothetical strangers than she had been giving to herself. She had been so focused on being understanding and accommodating, so committed to seeing Marcus's perspective, and making allowances for his behavior, that she had forgotten to advocate for her own well-being. She had been treating his comfort as more important than her own dignity, his opinions as more valuable than her own truth. Armed with this new clarity, Sarah began to make changes that felt both terrifying and essential. She started saying no to social events where she felt she had to perform a diminished version of herself. She stopped preemptively apologizing for her enthusiasm or intelligence. She began to share her opinions without immediately qualifying them or checking Marcus's reaction for approval. Each small act of self-advocacy felt like a rebellion against years of conditioning, and each time she chose her own truth over Marcus's version of her, she felt a little more like herself again. But perhaps the most important change was in how she spoke to herself. Sarah realized that she had internalized Marcus's voice so completely that even when he wasn't around, she was criticizing herself through his lens, anticipating his disapproval, editing her own thoughts to align with his preferences. Breaking free from external manipulation meant nothing if she continued to manipulate herself with his borrowed words. She began to practice speaking to herself with the kindness she would show a dear friend, challenging the harsh inner critic that sounded suspiciously like her husband. The hardest part of Sarah's journey wasn't recognizing the problem or even standing up to Marcus, it was learning to trust herself again. After years of being told that her perceptions were wrong, her reactions were excessive, her instincts were flawed. She had lost confidence in her own ability to navigate the world. Every decision felt uncertain, every interaction fraught with second-guessing. Tinez helped her understand that this was normal, that regaining trust in yourself after psychological manipulation takes time and practice. You're not just changing your behavior, she explained. You're rebuilding your relationship with yourself. That's profound work. As Sarah continued to reclaim her authentic self, Marcus's resistance grew more pronounced. He began to accuse her of being influenced by outside forces, her therapist, her sister, her feminist friends, rather than accepting that her changes might be coming from her own growth and self-reflection. He suggested that she was going through some kind of midlife crisis, that she was being selfish and ungrateful for the stable life he had provided. These accusations were designed to make her doubt her own motivations, to make her feel guilty for wanting more respect and autonomy in her marriage. But Sarah had learned to recognize these tactics for what they were, attempts to regain control by making her feel unstable and unreasonable. Instead of accepting Marcus's interpretation of her behavior, she asked herself the questions Dr. Martinez had taught her. What do I know to be true about my own experience? What do I need to feel respected and valued in this relationship? What would I tell a friend in my situation? The answers to these questions consistently pointed in the same direction toward more honesty, more boundaries, more insistence on being treated as an equal partner whose thoughts and feelings mattered. The transformation in Sarah's professional life was equally remarkable. As she stopped filtering her ideas through Marcus's critical lens, her creativity and confidence at work began to flourish. She volunteered for projects that challenged her, spoke up in meetings with ideas that felt risky but innovative, and gradually rebuilt the reputation for boldness and insight that she had once been known for. Her colleagues began to seek her out for her perspective, and her supervisor started giving her more responsibility and recognition. The contrast between how she was received at work and how she was received at home became stark and undeniable. At the office, her enthusiasm was seen as an asset. At home, it was treated as a liability. At work, her strong opinions were valued as leadership material. At home, they were criticized as being too much. Her colleagues appreciated her attention to detail and thorough preparation. Marcus complained that she was obsessive and anxious. The same qualities that made her successful professionally were consistently pathologized in her marriage. This realization led Sarah to a painful but necessary conclusion. Her marriage was not a partnership where she was encouraged to be her best self, but a dynamic where her success and confidence were seen as threats that needed to be managed and contained. Marcus wasn't malicious, but he was unwilling to examine his own behavior or consider that his perspective on Sarah might be wrong. When she tried to discuss the patterns she had identified, he dismissed her concerns as therapy talk and refused to acknowledge that anything needed to change. The decision to end her marriage wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was the slow, careful conclusion that came from finally understanding her own worth and refusing to accept less than she deserved. Sarah realized that she had been so focused on being a good wife, accommodating, understanding, flexible, that she had forgotten to ask whether Marcus was being a good husband to her. Love, she came to understand, wasn't supposed to require her to become smaller. True partnership meant celebrating each other's strengths, not constantly managing each other's supposedly problematic traits. The conversation where Sarah told Marcus she wanted a divorce was unlike any other difficult conversation they had had, because for the first time, she wasn't seeking his approval or trying to make him understand. She wasn't asking for permission to feel the way she felt or apologizing for her conclusions. She was simply informing him of a decision she had already made, based on her own assessment of what she needed to be happy and healthy. When he responded with accusations and attempts to make her feel guilty, she didn't engage with his emotional manipulation. She had learned to distinguish between his feelings and her responsibility for those feelings. The months that followed the divorce were challenging in ways Sarah hadn't expected, but also healing in ways she couldn't have imagined. Living alone for the first time in 15 years, she had to relearn how to trust her own preferences, her own rhythms, her own responses to the world. She discovered that without Marcus's constant commentary, she was naturally more relaxed, more creative, more generous with others. She wasn't the anxious, overwhelming person he had convinced her she was. She was thoughtful, passionate, and deeply empathetic. Sarah also had to learn how to navigate the social aftermath of her decision. Some mutual friends, influenced by Marcus's version of events, seemed to believe that she had left a perfectly good marriage because of unrealistic expectations or midlife restlessness. Others, particularly the women who knew her well, saw the change in her as evidence that leaving had been exactly the right choice. "You look like yourself again," her friend Rebecca told her over lunch, 6 months after the divorce was finalized. "I didn't realize until now how muted you had become." Perhaps the most profound change was in Sarah's relationship with her own voice, literally and figuratively. She noticed that she spoke more loudly, laughed more freely, shared her opinions with confidence rather than apology. She started taking up space in conversations again, trusting that her thoughts and experiences had value. She began writing something she had loved in college, but had abandoned after Marcus suggested that her creative writing was self-indulgent. Her words flowed onto the page with an ease that surprised her, as if they had been waiting patiently for permission to exist. 2 years after her divorce, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Lisa, who had gotten her number from Rebecca. Lisa explained that she was struggling in her own marriage, feeling criticized and diminished by her husband's constant feedback. Rebecca had suggested that talking to Sarah might be helpful because she had been through something similar. As Sarah listened to Lisa describe her situation, the way her husband corrected her social behavior made her feel embarrassed about her interests, convinced her that her emotional responses were excessive. She felt a deep recognition and a fierce protectiveness. "Lisa," Sarah said gently, "I want you to imagine that a stranger was treating your best friend the way your husband treats you. What would you tell your friend?" There was a long pause before Lisa whispered, "I would tell her she deserves better." "Yes," Sarah said, "you would, and so do you." It was the beginning of many such conversations, as Sarah found herself becoming a source of support for other women who were questioning their own relationships, their own self-worth, their own right to be treated with respect and kindness. These conversations taught Sarah something important about her experience. It wasn't unique or unusual, but part of a larger pattern of how women are often taught to make themselves smaller to accommodate others' comfort. She realized that the skills she had learned in reclaiming her own voice, trusting her perceptions, setting boundaries, refusing to accept others' negative definitions of her character, were skills that many women needed to develop. Her personal healing had become a kind of wisdom that could benefit others. Sarah's professional life continued to flourish as well. 3 years after her divorce, she was promoted to creative director, a position that required exactly the kind of bold vision and passionate leadership that Marcus had once convinced her were professional liabilities. During her first presentation to the executive team in her new role, Sarah felt a moment of profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this point. She was presenting with the full force of her creativity and intelligence, holding nothing back, trusting that her ideas had value. The enthusiasm she brought to her work was no longer something to be hidden or apologized for, but the very quality that made her effective as a leader. But success in her career, though deeply satisfying, wasn't the most important measure of Sarah's growth. The real victory was in the small daily moments when she chose to trust herself when she spoke up in a group conversation without first checking everyone else's faces for approval, when she pursued interests that brought her joy without worrying whether others found them worthwhile, when she set boundaries in relationships without feeling guilty for protecting her own well-being. Each of these moments was a small act of revolution against the voice that had once convinced her she was too much, too loud, too intense, too flawed to deserve respect and love. Sarah's story reminds us that emotional manipulation is often invisible, wrapped in language of love and concern, delivered by people who may genuinely believe they're helping us become better versions of ourselves. The most dangerous lies aren't the obvious ones shouted in anger, but the subtle ones whispered with apparent care, the suggestions that our natural enthusiasm is embarrassing, that our strong opinions are inappropriate, that our emotional responses are excessive. These lies are particularly dangerous because they make us complicit in our own diminishment, turning us into collaborators in the project of making ourselves smaller. Learning to recognize these patterns requires developing what Sarah came to think of as emotional sovereignty, the understanding that you are the ultimate authority on your own experience, your own character, your own worth. It means learning to distinguish between feedback that helps you grow and criticism that makes you shrink, between love that celebrates who you are and control that demands you become someone else. It means understanding that your thoughts and feelings don't need external validation to be real and important. If you recognize yourself in Sarah's story, if you found yourself apologizing for your personality or editing your opinions to match someone else's comfort level, if you've been convinced that your natural way of being in the world is somehow wrong or too much, then Sarah's journey offers you a powerful reminder. You are not the problem that needs to be solved. Your enthusiasm is not embarrassing, it's life-giving. Your strong opinions are not inappropriate. They're evidence of a mind that engages deeply with the world. Your emotional responses are not excessive. They're signs of a heart that feels fully and loves completely. The process of reclaiming your authentic self isn't always comfortable or easy. It requires courage to question voices you've trusted, strength to stand up for yourself when others prefer you diminished, and patience to rebuild trust in your own perceptions and judgments. But on the other side of that difficult work lies something invaluable: the freedom to be fully yourself, to take up the space you deserve, to speak with your own voice rather than the echo of someone else's limitations. Sarah's story also teaches us about the ripple effects of personal healing. When you stop accepting less than you deserve, when you refuse to make yourself small for others' comfort, when you insist on being treated with respect and kindness, you don't just change your own life, you give others permission to do the same. Your courage to honor your own worth becomes a beacon for others who are still learning to trust their own value. Your refusal to accept emotional manipulation makes it harder for that behavior to be normalized in your communities and relationships. Today, Sarah lives in a small house near downtown Portland that reflects her own taste rather than someone else's vision of what she should want. The walls are painted in colors that make her happy, filled with art that speaks to her soul, lined with books that feed her curiosity. She has built a life that feels authentically hers, surrounded by people who celebrate her strengths, rather than focusing on her supposed weaknesses. She has learned that love, romantic, platonic, or self-love, should never require you to become less than you are. But perhaps the most beautiful part of Sarah's transformation is how she now moves through the world with the confidence of someone who knows her own worth, the generosity of someone who has learned to extend grace to herself, and the wisdom of someone who understands that true strength comes not from making yourself small enough to fit into spaces that were never designed for you, but from having the courage to find or create spaces where you can be fully yourself. If there's one thing I hope you take from Sarah's story tonight, it's this: your voice matters, your perspective has value, and your authentic self is not something that needs to be fixed or contained or apologized for. You deserve to be loved for exactly who you are, not for who someone else thinks you should become. You deserve relationships that celebrate your strengths, not ones that focus on managing your supposed flaws. You deserve to take up space, to speak with confidence, to trust your own wisdom. And if you find yourself in a situation where others are trying to convince you that your natural way of being is wrong, too much, inappropriate, or embarrassing, remember Sarah standing in her kitchen that Tuesday night, finally questioning the narrative that had been built around her. Remember her choice to trust her own truth over someone else's criticism. Remember that sometimes the most radical act of love is refusing to let others make you smaller than you were meant to be. Your story is still being written. Your voice is still finding its strength. Your authentic self is still emerging, no matter how long it has been hidden or silenced. And like Sarah, you have the power to choose truth over comfort, growth over compliance, and self-love over the approval of those who would rather see you diminished. The mirror will reflect back to you exactly what you choose to see. Make sure it's the truth of who you really are, not the distortion of who others think you should be. Thank you for listening tonight. If Sarah's story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their own worth. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, healing, and the journey back to yourself. Until next time, remember that you are enough, exactly as you are.